Idaho Falls, Idaho. Population in the summer of 1996, just under 50,000 people. A mostly Mormon community tucked along the Snake River, the kind of town where neighbors know each other by first name, where doors are rarely locked, where the biggest story of the week is usually the weather or the high school football scores. On the morning of June 13th, 1996, that changed forever. An 18-year-old girl named Angie Dodge didn't show up for her shift at the beauty supply store where she worked. At first, nobody panicked.
Teenagers oversleep. Teenagers forget to call in. But when someone finally went to check on her, in the small, second-floor apartment she had moved into only 3 weeks earlier, they found something no one in that town would ever fully recover from. Angie had been raped. She had been stabbed to death, with a violence so extreme that one of the first officers on scene, a man with 15 years on the job by that point, would later say it was the worst crime scene he had ever worked. Her killer left something behind. DNA. Clean.
Untouched. Exactly the kind of forensic evidence that today might close a case within days. It would take 23 years. And somewhere in the middle of those 23 years, that evidence, the very thing that should have protected an innocent man, would instead help send one to prison for a crime he didn't commit. This is the story of the murder of Angie Dodge. It's a story about a broken interrogation room, a DNA sample nobody could match for over 2 decades, and a mother who quite literally refused to let her daughter's case die, even after the state told her, twice, that it already had. Angie Ray Dodge was born on December 21st, 1977, in Vancouver, Washington. She was the youngest of 4 children and the only daughter of Jack and Carol Dodge. By all accounts, she was whip-smart, the kind of teenager who spent her free time tutoring younger kids in math and English.
She graduated from Idaho Falls High School with honors in 1995 and had just begun taking classes at Idaho State University. Like a lot of young people in Idaho Falls, Angie was part of a loose, ever-shifting social circle that spent its evenings along the trails by the Snake River. Locally, this group had a nickname, the River Rats. It wasn't a gang, and it wasn't anything sinister, just teenagers and young adults with not much else to do at night in a quiet town, gathering by the water, drifting in and out of each other's lives the way that age group does. 3 weeks before she died, Angie reached a milestone a lot of 18-year-olds look forward to. She moved into her very first apartment at 444 I Street, a modest second-floor unit in Idaho Falls. Her mother, Carol, remembers the last evening they spent together with an almost unbearable clarity. The two of them were talking, the way mothers and daughters do, about how hard it is growing up. Angie leaned her head onto her mother's shoulder. They rocked back and forth together, slowly, the way they used to when Angie was small. Before Carol left that night, Angie told her she loved her. Carol told her the same. Neither of them had any idea it would be the last time they'd ever say it to one another. Sometime after midnight, in the earliest hours of June 13th, someone broke into Angie's apartment while she slept. He raped her. He stabbed her, repeatedly, and with enough force and fury that investigators would later describe the scene as one of the most violent they had ever encountered. A stuffed teddy bear near her bed was soaked in blood. A bloody handprint was found on her body. And critically, though nobody knew it yet, so was the killer's own DNA, left behind during the assault. By the time Angie's absence from work was noticed and someone went to check on her, it was already too late. Idaho Falls police arrived to a scene that, for a town this size, was almost incomprehensible.
This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't an accident. This was a targeted, brutal, personal act of violence against an 18-year-old girl in her own home.
And the killer had, for reasons still unknown, chosen not to clean up after himself. He'd left a full, usable DNA profile at the scene, the single piece of evidence every future development in this case would eventually hinge on. The summer of 1996 came and went. So did the fall. Investigators had no suspects, no arrests, just a grieving family, an unsolved murder, and a stunned community that had never seen anything like this happen to one of their own children. And then, 6 months later, an arrest 400 miles away in a completely unrelated case in the state of Nevada would kick off a chain of events that would take more than 2 decades to fully unwind. Along the way, it would nearly destroy the life of a young man who had absolutely nothing to do with Angie's death. On January 5th, 1997, a man named Benjamin Hobbs was arrested in Ely, Nevada, and charged with sexual assault involving a knife. Hobbs was originally from Idaho Falls, and when word of that arrest reached detectives back home, working a 6-month-old cold case with no leads, they had an obvious next thought. Could this be their guy? Hobbs had been part of the same river rat circle as Angie Dodge, so investigators began pulling in his friends for questioning, hoping to build a case against him. One of those friends was a 20-year-old named Christopher Tapp. By most descriptions, Tapp was a bit of a lost kid, not a hardened criminal, just a young man still trying to find his footing in life, close to his mother, close to his friends, and by his own later admission, a little too fond of his pot parties. He'd been seen with Angie at a gathering the night before she died, which, in a friend group this size and this tight-knit, wasn't unusual in the slightest. On January 7th, 1997, detectives brought Tapp in for questioning for the first time. He told them flatly that he didn't know anything about the murder. He said he'd help if he could, but he was just a scared kid with nothing to offer. They let him go that day. They did not stop there. Over the following weeks, Tapp was brought back in. Again and again. 9 separate interviews in all, spread across roughly 3 weeks, adding up, by different accounts, to anywhere from 20 to nearly 60 hours in an interrogation room. He was given multiple polygraph examinations, at least 7 of them, later described by his own legal team as tools used not to find the truth, but to manufacture a confession. According to later expert reviews of the recorded interrogations, here is what happened inside that room. Detectives told Tapp he was facing the death penalty. They told him a friend had already placed him at the scene of the crime, which was not true. He went from knowing nothing to being present at the apartment, to holding Angie down while Hobbs and an unidentified third man raped and killed her, to eventually claiming he had personally been forced to cut her. Here is the detail that makes all of this so extraordinary and so troubling. At every single point during this evolving confession, the physical evidence never changed. The DNA recovered from Angie's body, the pristine, usable sample collected at the crime scene, did not match Christopher Tapp. It never had. It didn't match Benjamin Hobbs either. Faced with a confession that contradicted the forensic evidence at every turn, investigators didn't abandon the theory. They expanded it. They proposed that a third, unidentified attacker must have been the true source of the DNA, someone who was never found, never named, and never brought to trial, while the 2 men they did have in custody, men whose DNA excluded them, went to trial anyway. At trial, in May of 1998, prosecutors leaned on 2 pillars. First, Tapp's own shifting confession.
Second, the testimony of a young woman named Destiny Osborne, who claimed she had overheard Tapp and Hobbs discussing the murder at a party a few days after it happened.
Osborne admitted she'd been high at the time. Her account of what she supposedly overheard didn't line up cleanly with what Tapp himself had told police under interrogation. None of that stopped the case from moving forward. The most damaging testimony of all came from Detective Fuhrman himself, who told the jury that Tapp had known specific details about the crime, including what Angie had been wearing, before he was ever shown crime scene photographs. A court would later call this claim the crux of the state's entire case against Tapp. On May 28, 1998, a jury of 9 women and 3 men found Christopher Tapp guilty of rape and first-degree murder. He would be sentenced to decades behind bars. Benjamin Hobbs, the man detectives had originally set out to investigate, was never charged with anything related to Angie's death. His DNA hadn't matched either. He denied any involvement, then and always. And somewhere out there, free, was the man whose DNA actually had been recovered from Angie Dodge's body.
Carol Dodge sat through every single day of that trial. At the time, she wanted the death penalty for Christopher Tapp. Like nearly everyone else in that courtroom, she believed justice had finally been done for her daughter. It would take her almost a decade to change her mind. And when she finally did, it wouldn't be because a lawyer convinced her, or because a journalist uncovered some smoking gun. It would be because she made the excruciating decision to look at the evidence herself, with her own eyes, one more time.
For nearly 10 years, the case of Angie Dodge's murder was, as far as the state of Idaho was concerned, closed. Christopher Tapp was in prison. A jury had spoken. There was nothing left to investigate. But cases like this one rarely stay buried, especially when the person most devastated by the crime refuses to accept that the story is finished. Around 2007, the Idaho Innocence Project, working alongside researchers at Boise State University, began reviewing Tapp's case from the outside. They pulled the interrogation tapes. What they found alarmed them. A confession that had shifted and reshaped itself hour after hour, contradicted the entire time by physical evidence that never wavered. Then, in 2008, Carol Dodge made a decision that would ultimately change the entire trajectory of this case. She asked to see the interrogation tapes for herself. All of them. Roughly 60 hours of footage. She watched every single minute. What she saw did not match the confident, airtight story the prosecution had presented at trial a decade earlier. She saw a frightened young man being fed details. She saw him told what he must have done, rather than asked what he actually remembered. She saw his account shift and reshape itself over and over as he seemed to search for whatever answer would finally satisfy the detectives across the table. Carol, the same woman who had once wanted Christopher Tapp put to death, came to a conclusion that must have been almost impossible to sit with. She no longer believed he had done it. And if he hadn't done it, that meant the man who actually murdered her daughter had been walking free the entire time. She began showing up at the Idaho Falls police station regularly, sometimes daily. She combed through every file and every report she could get access to. This wasn't closure. If anything, it was the opposite of closure. Reopening the worst wound of her life, deliberately, over and over, because she had become convinced that justice, real justice, had never actually been served. At the end of 2012, new and more precise DNA testing was conducted on Angie's clothing and on the blood-soaked teddy bear recovered from the scene. The results were unambiguous. Neither Christopher Tapp nor Benjamin Hobbs were the source of that DNA. They never had been.
For Carol, it was confirmation of what she already believed. For the case itself, it was the beginning of the end of Tapp's conviction, though it would still take years to unwind completely. In 2014, a new and, at the time, largely untested technique offered a fresh lead, an early form of familial DNA searching run through a genealogy database connected to Ancestry.com. It pointed investigators toward a filmmaker living in New Orleans named Michael Usry Jr., a man whose father had donated a DNA sample years earlier for completely unrelated ancestry research. Detectives flew across the country, brought Usry into a state police office, and grilled him for hours. It turned out that as a teenager, Usry actually had passed through Idaho Falls once on a road trip with friends. For a moment, it looked like the case might finally be breaking open. Then, direct DNA testing came back. Usry wasn't a match. Another dead end, and another innocent man put through an ordeal because of imperfect science and understandable, if painful, suspicion. That same year, renowned false confession expert Steve Dreisen reviewed Tapp's interrogation tapes in full and issued a scathing formal report, calling the confession one of the most contaminated he had encountered in 15 years of studying the phenomenon. Momentum, slowly and painfully, kept building. And finally, in March of 2017, prosecutors agreed to a deal. Tapp's rape conviction would be vacated and his murder sentence reduced to time served. After 20 years in prison, Christopher Tapp walked free. But free did not mean cleared. His murder conviction still technically stood on the books, and the actual killer, whoever he was, had now had 21 years to build a life, undetected, while an innocent man served every single day of his sentence in his place. The case was about to take its final, and in many ways, its most extraordinary turn. After Tapp's release, the Idaho Falls Police Department made a decision that would ultimately crack the case wide open for good. They partnered with the Idaho Innocence Project and a private company called Parabon Nanolabs to attempt something that, at the time, had only succeeded in a small handful of cases nationwide: investigative genetic genealogy. It's worth pausing here to explain what that actually means, because it's the single most important development in this entire story. Traditional DNA testing works by comparing a crime scene sample directly against a known suspect, or against a government database of convicted offenders, called CODIS. If your suspect, or someone exactly like them, isn't already in that system, you get nothing, no match. And for over 20 years, that's exactly what happened, again and again in the Dodge case. Idaho Falls police would later say they had submitted well over 100 DNA samples to the state crime lab over the life of the investigation. Every single one came back negative. Investigative genetic genealogy works completely differently. Instead of trying to match the killer directly, investigators upload his genetic profile to public genealogy databases, the same kind of databases ordinary people use to research their own family history. The system looks for partial matches, second cousins, third cousins, distant relatives who happen to share enough DNA to be identifiable. From there, genealogists build an old-fashioned family tree using public records, obituaries, and historical documents, working forward, generation by generation, branch by branch, until the tree narrows down to a small number of living men who fit the age and location profile of the killer. The technique had made international headlines a year earlier, in 2018, when it helped identify California's Golden State Killer after more than 4 decades. Investigators in Idaho Falls hoped it might finally do the same for them. The genealogist assigned to the Dodge case was Cece Moore. She would later say this was one of the most difficult cases she had ever worked, in large part because the original DNA sample collected in 1996 and stored for over 2 decades, had degraded significantly over time. By late 2018, working through the public database GED Match, Moore traced the killer's family line back to a couple, Clarence and Cleo Ussery. From that starting point, she identified 6 living male descendants as possible suspects. One of them had, notably, lived in Idaho at the exact time of the murder.
Investigators quietly tailed him and collected a discrete DNA sample. It wasn't him. 3 more months of painstaking, old-fashioned genealogical research followed, poring over records, tracing branches of the family tree that had gone cold. Finally, Moore identified a 7th descendant of the same family line, someone who hadn't previously come up in the investigation at all. His name was Brian Lee Dripps Sr.
And here is the detail that still stops people in their tracks whenever this case is discussed. Brian Dripps had lived directly across the street from Angie Dodge back in 1996. Detectives had actually interviewed him just 5 days after the murder. He'd been cleared on the spot, more than 2 decades before his name would resurface as the answer to the entire case. In May of 2019, investigators traveled to Caldwell, Idaho, where Brian Dripps was now living, and began quiet, patient surveillance. For roughly 20 hours, they watched him, waiting for the one opportunity that would let them collect his DNA without ever having to ask his permission.
Under U.S. law, once someone discards an item, a piece of trash, a used cup, a cigarette, they generally give up any expectation of privacy over it. Investigators didn't need a warrant to test something Dripps had already thrown away. They just needed him to throw something away. Eventually, he did. Dripps rolled down his car window and flicked out a cigarette butt. Detectives retrieved it, rushed it to the lab. It was a full, direct match to the DNA recovered from Angie Dodge's body in 1996. On May 15th and 16th, 2019, Brian Lee Dripps Sr. was arrested. Under interrogation, he confessed, and what he said upended every theory the case had operated under for more than 2 decades. He hadn't acted with an accomplice. There was no third man. He told police that he had been drunk and high on cocaine that night in June of 1996, that he broke into Angie's apartment while she was asleep, and that he had never even met Christopher Tapp. 23 years of theories about multiple attackers, hidden accomplices, and a tight-knit friend group turned violent. All of it collapsed in a single interview room in minutes. At the press conference announcing the arrest, the Idaho Falls police chief said something that would be repeated in nearly every piece of coverage that followed, that this case, from beginning to end, had been carried forward by one person: Angie's mother, Carol Dodge. 2 months later, on July 17th, 2019, a judge formally vacated Christopher Tapp's murder conviction. Tapp, now in his 40s, having spent nearly his entire adult life up to that point behind bars for a crime he did not commit, was declared innocent in open court of all charges. In February of 2021, Brian Dripps pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and rape. That June, he was sentenced to life in prison, with 20 years before he would even become eligible for parole, a sentence his own attorneys acknowledged he would likely never live to see the other side of, given his declining health at the time. Angie's brother, Todd Dodge, told the court that Dripps hadn't simply taken his sister's life. He had detonated something at the center of their entire family that had never stopped shaking since. Power of a coerced confession, and the strange, almost improbable power of a discarded cigarette butt, a public genealogy database, and one mother's refusal to stop asking questions, finally delivering the truth more than 2 decades late.